Welcome everybody in Schema Therapy Made Simple. We're very lucky and I'm very excited to have with us Dr. David Bernstein, all the way from the Netherlands. He's joining us this evening for me and this morning or early afternoon for him. So welcome, David.
Thank you. Thanks, Nadine.
David is a bit of a legend in the schema therapy community. He's a clinical psychologist and expert in forensic psychology, and he's made significant contributions to the schema therapy model, being one of the pioneers involved in schema therapy, and as well as significant contributions to research with a large randomized controlled trial in forensic populations. He's also really helped develop the model, which is why I'm so excited to have him here tonight. David's also an associate professor of Maastricht University. He has created the iModes cards, which many of you would have seen the wonderful videos about when David demonstrates working with modes with the cards in the Schema Therapy Made Simple group. And if that wasn't enough, David is also the founder of the Safe Path Institute, which I'll get David to explain a bit more later, but is really a program to create safer and healthier team and client and patient experiences in the workplace. So I'm sure everybody is as thrilled to have you here as I am, and some of those will be joining us live and many people watch it on the replay. Okay. So have I got that about right, David? Did I cover?
Well, that was such a flattering introduction, so you must have gotten it right. Thank you very much.
Okay. So tell us, seeing as you have been involved with schema therapy for such a long time, tell us, how did you become a schema therapist, or how did the model find you?
Yeah, well, it was really a long time ago, you know. I started actually first working at Jeffrey Young's clinic in New York.
Right.
In 1998.
Wow.
And,
okay.
Yeah, and without going through the whole story of how I found it, you know, I was originally psychodynamically trained. You know, I was trained in New York City, so we all got psychodynamically trained. Then I started working in the addiction field in my first job, you know, and a lot of these guys also, you know, had serious criminal backgrounds, all kinds of stuff. Well, you know, the psychodynamic treatment really wasn't appropriate for very many of them, you know, very few of them. And so then I learned CBT, and that, you know, was better in some ways, but it didn't really, because it was a much more active approach and problem focused, but it didn't really get to the core of their problems. And then I came across Jeff's work, and at that point it was very new. It was pretty much off the radar. You know, the big randomized clinical trial in the Netherlands, I think, was just getting organized, or maybe even not at that point. It was soon to be organized. So I was looking for something, like, you know, I've worked in personality disorders my whole career, and I was looking for something that was more effective. And of course, the evidence wasn't there yet, but when I found out more and I started working at his clinic on a part-time basis next to my teaching job, I just found that I was getting these great results that I had never been able to get with personality disorder patients. Right. And that's what sold me on it. And then I was lucky enough later on to, you know, encounter Arnoud Arntz, and we started corresponding. And then he invited me to come to the Netherlands, and that's how this whole thing happened. That's the whole story.
Right. Okay. And how long have you been in the Netherlands?
Since 2004. So, you know,
a really long time.
Coming close to 20 years now. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And you're really well renowned for your work with schema therapy for forensic clients. And I'm curious about what led you to work with forensic clients as your preference, you know, as your passion.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's funny because for a lot of people, they think, like, why would you choose to work with these guys, you know? Yeah. But it's funny what just grabs you. I mean, I got into it via the addiction field. So, you know, I just discovered when I was doing my clinical internship year as part of my clinical psychology training in New York, I had to choose an internship, you know? And I just happened to choose one that involved addiction. I didn't really know why, and I just loved it. Right. You know, it's funny, something just grabs you, you know? I just found that I had an affinity for these kinds of patients. And actually the work that I've done over the years, it's been kind of at the intersection of a bunch of things. You know, one is, you know, child abuse and neglect. I did a lot of early work on that and developing questionnaires and doing research in that area. And then addiction. And I was also in working with addiction populations, especially in the Bronx in New York, where I was working. You can't miss the overlap with criminality and aggression and so forth. And even at that point, I was kind of struggling. Did I want to more continue to focus on the trauma area or more focus on criminality and violence? And I, at a certain point, I kind of thought, you know, there are enough people doing research and so forth on what it's like from the victim's perspective. Not to say that's not valid, it's very important, but there weren't that many people working with perpetrators. You know, in other words, try to break the cycle of violence. Many of these people have trauma backgrounds.
Sure.
And then you can imagine, in a sense, they're perpetuating a cycle of violence and creating more victims. And I thought, well, that's a place where I can make contributions. And that's kind of how I got into it. And it's not easy work, but it can be very, very rewarding work. You know, if you
yeah,
don't
and I
mind.
think if you have that underpinning of the bigger goal of, if for some of these people they don't continue to reoffend, which is a very common cycle, right? Then that could really kind of give you that inner strength to keep going and keep working on that. Because, you know, I'm sort of on the opposite side of you. I've spent my life working with victims of sexual abuse generally, and sexual assault. And if we could just reduce that by 50%, I sometimes say to people, without those two things, I wonder if I would even have a career, because it's so common in complex trauma and all sorts of recurrent mental health difficulty presentations. So
right,
yeah,
absolutely. But you know, what's interesting is, you know, when I was starting to work again with, you know, drug addicted patients and so forth in the Bronx, and we're talking now about a long time ago, that I started just asking them about their trauma histories. And there's a lot of these guys who've been in prison, you know, a lot of them. I was also doing research on psychopathy back then, and I knew what their psychopathy levels were. And these were guys who were pretty serious, you know, antisocial patients. I started interviewing them about their trauma histories, and I was just shocked how many of them had been traumatized growing up. And then what I realized is that we tend to have this dichotomy of victim perpetrator. And you know, I don't mean to say that we should reduce in any way the legitimacy of what, you know, victims experience. Many of these guys who are perpetrators, when they were young, they were victims. And that's, to me, what also helps to keep me going. And I think that's also what makes the forensic schema therapy model different, is that we work with those antisocial modes. You've got to work with them. You got to work with those modes in the room. You've got to, you know, not be Pollyannish. These guys have, you know, carry serious risks with them. So you got to confront that. But at the same time, for most of them, there is a traumatized child inside. And if you miss that, you're not going to get anywhere with them. You got to deal with both.
Yes, and absolutely. Every forensic psychologist I've ever talked to, or those who've worked in prison groups, talk about the degree of the ACEs present in those populations. But it's I guess, you know, that's where the schema model helps too, because if you think about the child's initial temperament and how that then might respond to that trauma, and there's the gender rolling in that as well. But yeah, I love hearing how passionately you talk about it. And obviously after such a long time as well, you've still got that mission there guiding you. So can you share what needed to be added in or adapted to the schema therapy model to work with forensic clients? And I guess it's more the antisocial spectrum, although I'm sure many of them have borderline personality kind of structures as well. That would be just really interesting for us to hear about.
Yeah, well, you know, when we first got started, the first thing was we had to, you know, first of all, we very quickly realized we had to work with modes rather than primarily with schemas. That was the first thing. Because the modes were just so present in the room, you know, especially the, you know, overcompensatory modes, you know, bully and attack or self-aggrandizer, also modes making distance. You know, so that was very important, was to, first of all, start to identify what some of those modes were, because it really, they weren't described in our literature, right? In our schema therapy literature. So when I started out with this was back in 2005, 2006, it was a matter of meeting with a lot of clinicians, hearing about the cases, starting to conceptualize them, and then, again, together with Arnoud Arntz, coming up with descriptions of some of these modes that are now kind of commonplace, that people would recognize them as, quote, forensic modes. And then we published a paper on it back in 2007, where we first presented it. And then beyond that, it was a matter of realizing, what makes, forensic schema therapy different than regular schema therapy. And it is still schema therapy. But I always say, when you're working in the forensic world, it's like you're dealing with the world at 3+ standard deviations above the mean. That's what you're dealing with. That's the extremity of what you're dealing with. A lot of what you have to do, first of all, is you have to work in the here and now. That's really crucial. And of course, for people watching who work with more severe patients, that that's also true of your patients. That you have to, because the modes otherwise will dominate the therapy sessions. It'll make it impossible for you to make any progress. So how you work in that interpersonal space when modes are present in the room, how do you deal with your own modes when they're triggered, and when you're faced with, this person's mode, because they're going to push you out of your comfort zone. It's not like, the typical kind of, hopefully not the kind of typical interactions you're having at home, these are really different. So you have to really become adept at that. And so that's, what in the forensic world we refer to as responsivity factors, or, therapy interfering factors. And we deal with that with regard to modes. You got to deal with the fact that many of these people are unmotivated when they first come to therapy.
Yeah.
And we deal with that with modes too, by identifying what are the modes that are standing in the way of motivation and engagement, and then working with those modes and realizing it's going to be a long haul, that the first year at least is going to be just simply engaging and motivating them and getting past some of those huge bodyguard modes and starting maybe to get to a little bit of what's behind them. And then furthermore, in the forensic field, you always have to remember, ultimately, it's about lowering risk. I mean, schema therapy is a very humane form of treatment, which I love. But in the forensic field, that person's going to walk out the door. And we have to make sure we lower the risks. So we have to target the risk factors for recidivism and so forth. And the way we do that is we conceptualize that in terms of modes. We ask, we look at the crime scenarios, which typically get repeated over time. We ask ourselves, what are the main modes involved in those crime scenarios? And then we target those modes, in terms of lowering the those are kinds of the internal or psychological risk factors for recidivating. And so in a nutshell, that's what makes it different.
Right. So is the thinking that if those modes become less dominant or less able to be triggered, then the general population will be safer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And when the patient's healthy adult mode is strengthened as a protective factor. So we're always thinking about the relative levels of risk and protective factors in forensic psychology. So if the healthy adult mode represents the protective factor and all those strengths that are part of that, and then the dysfunctional modes are the risk factors, particularly the ones that are involved in the events leading up to committing crimes and the crimes themselves. It's a matter of trying to go from here to here. And we know that these people will always be at risk to some degree, hopefully less, and we measure that, but they'll always be at risk to some degree. But we want them to be aware of those modes, to know what the signals are, so that they can do things differently, or they can seek help if they need to. So that I think that a definition of a recovered forensic patient, a serious patient, is one who comes right up to the line but doesn't go over it. I think that's actually the definition.
Yes, and so it would be like the healthy adult mode is able to hold the line almost, make sure they don't. Yeah,
the healthy adult mode at a certain point is going to go, oh my God, I'm noticing my predator modes getting triggered here. Or oh my God, I see that through this mode or that mode, I've come back to my risk scenario, the situation that if I continue down this path, I'm going to go back to crime. I have a choice to make. What am I going to do here? Is it worth it? What's important to me? What are my values? And then if necessary, seek help, or, in some cases they can handle it on their own. So that's really a realistic picture, I think, of what a well-treated forensic patient is like with schema.
And is the values work really core to the forensic model in terms of embedding that in the healthy adult? Because with some of the backgrounds that offenders have come from, like values that would serve them probably are not part of that family culture or that they've been raised in. So I just wondered, do you need to introduce options that they may like to select instead of the original rules?
That's a really nice observation. Now, I have to say, I think in our model, we don't necessarily do it that explicitly. And maybe it would have value to do a little bit more explicitly. But I think it's very implicit because, it's implicit in the therapy relationship. I think to a large degree, and it's true of parenting in general, it's not what we say, it's what we do. And I think that for many of these people, they've never had ever in their lives a secure attachment. And many of them have come from very violent backgrounds or been abandoned repeatedly and neglected and so forth. So by experiencing the fact that it's possible to trust somebody and to have a safe relationship with somebody, right? If you think about that, what a huge thing that is, and how long it takes before they really believe it. Because that's a lot of what's driving a lot of those heavy duty modes, is the deep, deep mistrust that they have of other human beings. So, and we don't generally, and I'm not saying you couldn't do this, have, discussions about, we will have discussions about what's important to you and what would you like to do, what your goals are. But I think it's more, for us at least, it's more implicit in that therapy relationship. It's a very good question.
Yeah, as we've been talking, I wonder about how that would be done without it feeling like it was being imposed on someone. And, in some other models, say, for example, EMDR, which I am heavily subscribed to, there's an idea about innate wisdom. And if we remove the wounding, then people would naturally have some of these core values that they would need anyway. You don't always have to. Yeah, so I guess it depends. And then it's also...
Well, it's a nice thought. And maybe it's true. But look, there is an approach within my field called the good lives model.
Yeah.
And you probably haven't heard of it because you have to be in the forensic field to know this. It's basically the idea that when it comes to more psychopathic patients, you'll never be able to change them in their core. So what do you do? And they also are quite insensitive to punishment. They don't really care if you punish them, but they are very oriented toward rewards. So in the good lives model, the role of the therapist is kind of like the consigliere to the mafia boss. It's if you're the forensic patient, then I'm going, Don so-and-so, do you think it's a good idea for you to go back and do that thing? What's important to you? You told me you want to have a life with a house and a picket fence and a dog. Are you going to get... So that's the good lives model, okay? But it is based on an assumption that these people cannot change in their core. But if they're motivated, you can kind of help them to find a better way. Now, I think it's a reasonable model for some patients, but our model is that many, but I don't think all, many of these patients we think can change in their core to some degree because we think that they have potential that is there. And maybe this gets closer to what you're saying about the EMDR. The potential is the potential that all children have. It gets realized when they have healthy attachment relationship.
Yeah, and in schema, the attachment relationship would be emphasized more than in EMDR, but I do think both of the models have this idea that true healing can happen and change is possible for most people. So, yeah.
And if I didn't believe that, I would not work in this field.
No. Well, it's a bit, the good lives model, I'm sure, for me, that feels a little depressing, even for the people themselves. This is as good as it gets, and you're just going to be kind of rewards motivated, and that's it. But
you do see some of these guys who get treatment, who are psychopathic guys who get treated with like the good lives model or something equivalent. And what do they end up doing? they end up like having a villa in a jungle with a high security fence. And usually they have some girlfriend who lives with them. And they never leave. And maybe they send their people out to go and get takeout. And that's a good life in a sense, because they're not hurting anybody. They're not committing crime. But that's not the kind of life necessarily that we're going after. We're going for something hopefully a little bit more engaged and a little bit more a part of society than that.
And so with the work, I mean, it sounds like a lot of it happens in the forensic setting, but are there, not outpatient, what's it called? I forget.
Yeah, outpatient, sure, ambulance, outpatient.
Or
Yeah, outpatient.
Post, I've got all my medical terms like post-discharge, but when you leave prison, you know.
Yeah, post clinical treatment or, yeah, absolutely, yeah, sure.
Yeah, to help support when they're released in the community. Does the program continue to that?
Well, you know, it depends. In the Dutch system, which is one of the best in the world, there's a kind of phased care, right? So once they show that their risk levels are going down and they're showing some indications of being successfully treated, not completely, but at least, you know, it's heading in the right direction, then they're given practice in the community. First, supervised leave, you know, where, you know, they're going out there with somebody from the institution, like what we call sociotherapist, a kind of psychiatric nurse. And then if that goes well, then they're given unsupervised leave, you know, with still a lot of structure. They have to come back and talk about what's going on. That's usually when they're working in the community or, you know, able to do home visits and so on and so forth. And then they're eventually faced to something where they're living independently. And if they have not committed crimes for a sufficient amount of time, usually then their sentence is terminated and they're free, you know. But there also are people who have lower levels of risk to start with, okay? You know, for example, you think about, you know, many offenders for domestic violence, they have maybe some antisocial modes, but many of them don't rise to the level of these more severely antisocial patients that we treated. And these kinds of patients also sometimes get treated with schema therapy, but it's entirely done on an outpatient basis, on an ambulant basis. So they may never be sent to prison or to a psychiatric hospital for forensic hospital, but the entire treatment will be outpatient.
This is a little outside of the scope of the interview, but I read an interesting article the other day about the Norway system and how the prisoners actually have day jobs and then they come back and sleep at the prison. And it was just such a different model to here in Australia, where it's literally total loss of contact with community. And I thought, gosh, that, because a lot of the times prison doesn't help people. And I think if there is a way to keep people engaged, but also have some sort of consequence, it could be a lot healthier.
You know that, you know, we actually did, Limor Navoda and I did an online training in forensic schema therapy around the time that the pandemic started for a large group of psychologists who work in correctional services in New South Wales. And I've also been supervising some therapists in the forensic field in Australia. And so we already have some people who are trained in Australia. And I do think that what you see there is that they are pushing up against the constraints of the systems that are there. And whether, if schema therapy makes more inroads in Australia, whether it will lead to some changes, or maybe in other countries, because Australia is not an outlier, it's more what's typical, right? I mean, what's in the Netherlands is not typical. What's in Australia is more typical. It'll be interesting to see if schema therapy over time can lead to more systemic changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can only hope, but the current model doesn't really lead to great outcomes for the majority of people. So in terms of the, not talking about the therapy that's delivered, but that system that therapy has to be delivered in is quite punitive for people. So outside of all this wonderful work and research you've done in forensic, you've also been sharing with us your videos about the iMode cards and work with modes. Tell me a bit about what led you to develop the cards.
Yeah, the cards. Well, you know, it's funny. Initially, it grew out of my forensic work. So when we were doing our randomized clinical trial of schema therapy, we did not incorporate the iModes because they didn't exist yet. So when we would talk with patients about modes, we were just talking, or maybe we're making a mode map and drawing something, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And for some of the patients, it really worked well. But for other ones, you just kind of had a feeling that they really had a hard time taking it in.
Mm.
And even with that, we still got, pretty good results. But even so, at a certain point, I don't know why, but I had this idea, well, maybe you could use images, the modes. And I have been interested in cartooning for a long time. I'm terrible at drawing. But my son, who's now almost 20, is a very good cartoonist, and he had a cartooning teacher in his primary school whom he loved. And I met him, and he was a great guy. So I met with him. I said, would you mind meeting with me? We can talk about this idea. It turned out that a family member of his had been in schema therapy.
Right.
And he knew all about it. And he was also somebody on a part-time basis who worked with troubled youth. How good is that? And so we started working together, working on a few modes at a time. The whole process took us about 3 years. We went through multiple drafts of most of the drawings. And then what was very interesting, before we had the colored version, we had a kind of pen and ink prototype. And I sent them to a bunch of my colleagues, not only forensic, but in other areas, non-forensic. And I said, would you mind trying some of these out with some of your patients, see what kind of experiences you have? Sure. And then they came back and they said, this is great. It really helps. It really facilitates working with modes. And that's kind of then what made me realize, this could have much broader applicability, that it's not only for forensic, it's not only for patients also who may have, let's say, lower IQs and might have trouble with processing the verbal information, that it seems to be very facilitative in general. And our research really supports that. We have an article, which I'm trying to finish up for publication, where we looked at it in about 1,000 people. And we found that people can just readily recognize what the modes are, and and we're doing other studies and have just published a study in police officers using the iModes. So we've got some research also supports the fact of how facilitative this is compared to just talking about modes.
Yeah, I think I can exactly see how they would work for. When I used to work with children quite a lot, and you're used to using all sorts of, basically, if children can hold something and turn around and choose something, it deepens the therapy and opens up the conversations. Absolutely. And I think that's really the same. I often say to many of my supervisees, anything that works well with children does work well with adults. It's just a little how you pitch it, but
no, that makes a lot of sense. It really does. And the other thing I was thinking about that was also an influence on me back then when I was getting started with this, in these forensic hospitals that I worked in, we had a lot of creative arts therapists, people doing art therapy, drama therapy, music therapy. And I didn't really encounter it before then. And I was blown away at how well it worked. Yeah. And then it made me realize sometimes having a medium, whatever that medium might be, can be very facilitative, not only just, in schema therapy, we also do a lot of stuff, right? We work experientially. Yeah. But this is a kind of medium of communication. It helps a lot of people open up.
Yeah, and like with the cards, I think I could just imagine them being placed on chairs, and for people who don't, well, it depends how you work with chairs. Some people sit people in them, some people don't. But it sort of just creates a way to talk with that mode, which may be less threatening than directly going in, and all sorts of things. But it's so interesting to hear, like, you've put so much time and effort into really coming up with the right images and things that can work for your population. And so, I mean, the mode videos are great because I sometimes think of you as the king of schema therapy made simple, because every video I think, he's done it again. He's just made it really simple.
Well, you just made my day, so thank you.
This schema therapy model, it's not really simple. Like, it's quite complicated. And so that's one of the goals of this group that I facilitate, is trying to give people a way into it so they don't give up and think, this is just too much. And your videos are just, you seem to be able to take the heart out of the mode conversation and just give it to people without, sometimes people they talk about too many different types of modes or create too many rules, but it's just done in this way that I think is very helpful. So what made you decide to do the videos?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for saying that. And I do enjoy making the videos, although it's a bit of pressure to put them out every Tuesday, I must admit. So, but I feel some sense of commitment.
I thought you had made the whole lot. I thought you'd made the
No,
whole
I'm doing it on a weekly basis, you know?
Oh,
I make them on Monday morning, we release them on Tuesday, you know? So
okay.
that's it. No. But in any case, I also really appreciate the contribution that you make to our community, because it is really important for people to have places to go where you can get support and answers and so forth in this whole process. And I don't know, I think what partly inspired me to do it was that, number one, I think people who work in the forensic field know me well. People who've worked in SafePath, you know, this team-based approach that I developed know me well. But, you know, in more recent years, I think a lot of other people in the community, they know me, but they don't know that much about the kind of approach that I developed and so forth. And I think that there's a lot of stuff that I've learned over the course of time. Number one, very applicable to really all schema therapists, not only forensic schema therapists. So that was one impetus. I wanted to say, how can I bring this to, you know, the broader community? And the other thing is that I think in the schema therapy world, it's like we all have this demanding parent mode, you know, and that it's good if it pushes us to want to do better, but sometimes I see so much stress among schema therapists, particularly when they're first getting trained and learning the model, and trying to get it right. And then when they're going through the process, you know, of applying for accreditation, you know, trying to get their videos just right and their case conceptualizations. And, you know, I think the thing is, I think we do a very good job in our training programs, and there are many very good ones, of teaching people how to do things and teaching people the model. I think it's a very good job. But, you know, it also adds a lot of pressure. And when it comes down to it, it's basically like any therapy, it's two people in a room, you know?
Yes.
And there are a lot of things I've learned in the course of my career in various places that have more to do with, you know, connection and what the experience is like for yourself as a therapist. You know, it's kind of like schema therapy backstage, you know, like the stuff that isn't talked about as much. So anyway, that was part of the impetus, was to reach a broader group of people, but also share some of the things.
Well, I think it worked, because I did not expect you to be so easygoing and so relaxed, and so, because I thought forensic, oh, this is going to be like all the tricky stuff, but you certainly have been able to do that, and you've just got this very gentle style which comes across, and that might not be what people would expect from someone who can work with these big tough guys as well. So yeah, I think there's something just a lot in that, and I hope that people do watch this section of the video to recognize that many of the trainers and the supervisors do understand that people are putting a lot of pressure on themselves, and
absolutely,
you know, and I think sometimes there can be a little bit overly critical focus, but not everybody has that approach within the community. There's a lot of very welcoming people and people who guide you non-critically, yeah, I think the videos have really shown that. I wonder actually if you would have made 25 if you'd thought back now, you know, with that pressure of weekly. As at the time I thought, oh, 25, that's
I know. Well, you know, it's funny. I got the idea from a friend of mine who works, he's actually a business coach, and he had made a series, and he said, oh, that's great, you got to try it. Now, the thing is, his videos are like 1 to 2 minutes long.
Yeah.
But then I tried to do that and I couldn't do it in 1 or 2 minutes. I think what we're doing is more complex and it requires more explanation.
Schema therapy can be made simple, but not 1 to 2 minutes.
Not that simple.
Yeah. Anyway, they are great, and I do encourage people to watch them. And I actually, because I supervise quite a lot of people, not for accreditation, but they use schema therapy in EMDR, and I often say, oh, there's this video in my group, and I have to try and remember which one it was that you said the thing that's relevant, and it's quite helpful for them just to get a very snapshot of how you might talk about that with a client, or
Yeah.
You know, particularly the videos around self-disclosure and empathic confrontation, I thought were really great. Yeah,
And all of them, you know, they can also find them all on our website, because sometimes it may be hard to, you know, scroll back if you want to find a particular one or find a topic that you like. So you can also look on our website, and they're all.
That's probably that's what I might do. Just send them there, and they're
with
labeled with what they're about.
With a brief description.
Okay.
What
See,
is
that's
about.
a much smarter way of going about it than my way. I have to search in the group anyway. So what else did I want to ask you about? Oh, this is really going back to the beginning of the interview, but do you think your psychodynamic training did help you blend, or I guess I feel like schema therapy has quite a lend from psychodynamic at times in terms of the relational factors, and although you know CBT is great for the skills and that sort of thing, do you feel that was something that did help?
I think I would say yes. You know, you got to kind of sort through from, you know, more psychodynamic approaches, you know, what's helpful and what's unhelpful. And in my own experience, also in my own psychoanalysis, because in those days, all of us went through psychoanalysis, traditional on the couch, you know.
Yeah.
There is, I found it way too passive approach, way too passive. So, you know, okay. And there are a lot of other things about it that I don't agree with, but having said that, one of the things that it has that some other approaches don't is at its best, it focuses on the therapy relationship. And then the question is, though, in what way, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Certainly, I was trained to be that neutral blank screen. That was my initial screen. Now, you can imagine for somebody like me, I was terrible at it, you know. I mean, I tried. I put it the other way. I actually was good at it in the sense that I did what I was supposed to, and I got bad results because it's not me, and because the patients needed something more. They needed real connection, not somebody to project upon. Now, psychodynamic approaches have come a long way. It is much more interpersonal now, from what I gather.
Yes.
But at least they're willing to look at, you know, so-called transference, countertransference, the therapy relationship is important. And of course, attachment theory has become huge in psychodynamic approach. And there's, I think, where there's the most overlap with schema therapy.
Yeah, I think maybe it was some of the object relations principles that were brought into schema therapy. I'm just thinking about my readings, but yeah, I find that hard because I do think, like all of the therapies over 30, 40 years, they bring other bits that they know are working in different therapies, and it's hard to say whether they are what they used to be. But certainly I know Liz Lacey, who's my supervisor, and we have talked about in New York, there still is psychoanalysis happening, and just how it's actually quite harming for people with emotional deprivation and things like that, just to, and I actually have had clients here in little old Perth, which is a million miles away from New York, where they say, oh, the therapist just didn't talk to me, they just looked at me, and it's been really unhelpful. So but then it must be working for someone, because it still continues, you know, these people still have clients. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I can't really explain that so well. All I can say is my own experience of being in psychoanalysis, and I was very lucky. I had a very good psychoanalyst. He was a very human being.
Yeah.
I experienced also a lot of emotional deprivation, and that wasn't helpful. And at a certain point, I said to him, "I have to sit up and see you."
Yeah.
Thank God he said, "Okay." Up of this lying on the couch. And I'm telling you, I did the classical psychoanalysis, like, you know, something out of like the prehistoric times. And when we sat up, and I could see him and take in his facial expression, and he became more lively and more animated, that's when it took off. And when I think about what I got out of my own therapy with him that was positive, it was after that happened.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Do you know what? I wouldn't even do that as a client. I would not feel safe to lie down in a room where I couldn't see the person. Just wouldn't be.
In those days, we were all doing it, you know. The guy had a picture of Freud on the wall. He literally had a photo of Freud on his wall. Literally.
All right. Okay.
Talking about a different era. We're talking about the 80s in New York.
All right. So I'm just going to go to some of the questions. So I'm not sure if there's any. I haven't seen any in the the forum yet, but Melissa did ask as a pre-submitted question. So Melissa has got a background in working forensically, so she's really was excited about this interview. So she asked, for forensic clients who have a sexual offence history and childhood trauma, are there particular schemas or modes in profiling that you've noticed that may lead them on a pathway for using self-soothing versus overcompensating modes? The result of using the coping mode may be the reason they are sanctioned. An example would be an online sex offender procuring to feel validated. I haven't quite got the question right here. Which is different to a contact sex offender who believes they can have what they want versus someone who uses necrophilia, exhibition, or CEM, etc. Are there particular themes you've noticed? So it's a very big question.
Okay, so it's a very complex question, obviously. So I even, because you forwarded the question to me, I've been kind of struggling with how to answer it, and especially without taking an hour. So let me just say a few things about it. You know, one of the things that's very interesting is that many kinds of behaviors, you can't necessarily say there's always a one-to-one correspondence between a particular behavior and a particular mode. So different kinds of behaviors, like different kinds of sex offending, can also be related to different modes. And, you know, it depends also on the person and what those patterns are like. So for example, if you look at, and even within a particular category, like let's say you talk about, you know, pedophilic patients. Okay, that's kind of an unpleasant topic to have to talk about, right? Yeah. But on the one hand, you have people who are very socially introverted, are quite immature. If you think about it in terms of schema therapy, you talk about an undeveloped self schema, undeveloped self. And for some of them, they have fantasies about children as being pure and being good, and about themselves. They feel that they themselves, that is, the patients cannot trust the adult world. The adult world is not to be trusted, and they can, but children are innocent. And they truly believe that they're forming, some of them truly believe they're forming a kind of positive relationship, okay? So when you think about what are the schemas that are involved there, like undeveloped self, probably deep emotional deprivation in many of these people. And when you look at the modes in these people, very often there is a mode, you know, there's some of the strongest detached protector modes I have ever seen in my life are in these patients. Like a huge, thick wall. And who's behind that wall? No idea. And then they develop also modes that are facilitative of their crimes. So for example, a conning manipulator mode in order to con and manipulate their victims by the process of grooming. Okay, now in that same group of people who are pedophilic, you also have a group of more antisocial and psychopathic pedophilic patients, and they look totally different. They have a lot of the classic antisocial modes. They're not these withdrawn, socially odd, introverted kinds of people. In fact, if anything, they're much more socially skilled. They have they have a conning manipulator mode, but it's much more well-developed, much more sophisticated in a way. Social skills, right?
And these people, I mean, all offending against children is terrible, but my understanding is that some of this is quite cruel and sadistic offending against children as well in this group of people that you're talking about. Can be,
absolutely. It can be, a lot of it can be about power and rage and so forth. So the motivations also can be vastly different. And in terms of the differences between, you know, people who download material and people who perpetrate actual, you know, contact offenses, I always had assumed that there would be big differences there, but actually recently came across some literature that suggested that there may not be such a big difference, and it may exist on a kind of spectrum. And I think that what you tend to see is a kind of escalating pattern, that over time, that it goes from bad to worse in terms of what they're doing, and then eventually they cross a line. And again, I'm thinking now more of, like, you know, there also are people who are not, you know, the total introverts, but may also under stress that it may be initially a kind of self-soothing activity. So these are not, again, those kind of introverted pedophilic types. It could be people even who have adult heterosexual relationships at times.
Yeah.
But it becomes a kind of self-soothing activity. But then in some of them, it escalates and crosses a line. And is that an entitlement schema, or is it just a slippery slope? You know, that's the question.
Yeah.
And
certainly the way that it's dealt with in Australia is that this is a slippery slope behaviour, and everyone who's doing this is at risk of offending against children. In fact, you are offending against a child because that child's been harmed to make the video and things. So yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't actually thought about it as I know pornography use is seen sometimes as detached self-soothing, but doesn't always make sense to me in terms of what drives that. And but yes, it is a very complicated. In fact, I didn't even see him. I don't know what it is, and I thought I'm just going to ask it. I'm sure.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I could give a whole workshop just about the answer to that question. Yeah,
that's great. I'm not sure if anyone watching live's got a question they're most welcome to ask, and I think you've probably just been enjoying the conversation. So, I mean, obviously we've just been talking about really heavy stuff as part of that question. In the forensic study that you did, was child sex offending one of the main groups, or was it all sorts of groups?
Well, you know what's interesting about it, and this was kind of controversial, I insisted on excluding what you could call fixated pedophilic offenders.
Right.
There were sex offenders in there. It was so most of the offenders had violent offense. Almost all of them had violent offenses of some kind. The majority of those violent offenses were non-sexual in nature. A minority were sexual in nature. And then, of course, you have some people who've committed both kinds of offenses. We did have some pedophilic patients in there, but what I insisted upon was that, there are some offenders who have this very specific preference for child victims of a certain age and gender and so on and so forth. And I felt that's a different kind of thing than what we're trying to treat in our study. We're looking for
study on its own, isn't it?
Right, exactly. That these are the people with the cluster B personality disorders that we're focusing on, more antisocial. And I thought, we can't do both of these within the same study. And some people at some of the clinics I was collaborating with, they really were upset with me for excluding these folks. Why can't we learn at the same time? I thought, no, we've got to keep our focus. So
it's so interesting. I think the I'm missing out button gets pressed quite a lot, and that's just an example of, whenever you set a limit with someone about anything, it's like, but we can have both.
Not always. Not always.
Have it. I learned this a long time ago running the 2 Facebook groups I've got, that when you say, like, I have to say to people, no, you can't join this group because you're not a registered psychologist and you have to be, and they go, but that's exclusionary and that's not fair. And I say, well, we have to draw a line somewhere about what the group's about. So it doesn't surprise me that, and I guess, working with child sex offenders would be such a minority group experience as well. They probably would have liked to be included. But yeah, I mean, you're the expert, but I can 100% understand. And I'm just imagining if you had any kind of group intervention as part of the study, which you may or may not have, including a mix of child sex offender stuff, just wouldn't work anyway because of those dynamics in prisons and.
Right. Well, some of the people in our study were also, many of them were getting other forms of therapy at the same time. They were in these clinics, these inpatient environments where they had multimodal treatment, also group, also individual. But you're right, in general, the pedophilic sex offenders are not usually included in the general population. It just depends on where, which locations you're looking at, but generally not. So, but in any case, at that point, we were just trying to develop the tools for this very psychopathic antisocial group.
Yeah.
And it was beyond the scope of what we could do at that point.
Yeah,
but it remains to be done, and somebody should do it, but it won't be me. somebody can pick the ball and do it.
So, we've talked about iModes, and it might be nice just for the last few minutes just to talk a bit about your role in Safe Path and what the goals are with that, because I'd be really interested to hear about it.
Yeah, well, Safe Path, believe it or not, started as a kind of side thing because my randomized clinical trial of forensic schema therapy took so many years to do.
Mhm.
And we started it officially in 2007, and we completed it in 2015.
Mhm.
And then we completed processing the data in 2018. We finally published it in 2021.
Oh,
Okay, it's
yes.
insane. So I needed something to do on the side. So the thing on the side was that I started to see that, we could give a couple of hours a week of schema therapy, forensic schema therapy, and that did seem to help. But most of the time, these patients were on wards.
Mm.
And the environment on the wards could be quite different than what we were trying to foster in the individual therapy.
Mhm.
And so I had this idea, maybe we could create a kind of schema therapy for teams and organizations, because in these environments, like, psychiatric institutions, forensic institutions, prisons, addiction centers, it's almost always a multidisciplinary team approach.
Mm.
What I came to see over time was that the people who worked on these wards really needed support. And the reason is because it's very stressful work. You're dealing with the day-to-day interactions with people who often have some pretty severe modes, and a lot of them lack self-control, or they may be manipulative or threatening or whatever. Puts the team under stress. And of course, when the team is under stress, its own survival modes get triggered. And so then, the patient escalates, sometimes the staff member escalates. Sometimes the patient escalates and the staff member goes one down. We don't want that. Sometimes the patient escalates and the staff member just avoids, just stays in the nursing station, doesn't engage. Well, none of these are helpful, right? And so the idea was, could we use schema therapy principles to help? So initially, I trained the first team back in 2011. It was already before the iModes, which we published in 2014. And the first experience I had were really positive, but then I realized again that using the iModes could be very helpful. So once I had it developed, then we started incorporating it. And then I saw that how much better things went with it. Because first of all, the team members, most of them are not psychologists or whatever. They have different levels of training, and many of them had very minimal levels of training. Some of them came from police backgrounds or prison backgrounds or who knows what. So we needed something that could speak to everybody and that they could grasp. And then I realized that you could take the iModes and develop these, what they call serious games around them and exercises. And that when you started to train teams in a playful way, using the images, they loved it, they got it, it didn't feel like going to school and having a bad school experience, which a lot of these people had had, growing up. Instead, it felt fun and playful and engaging. And their learning style for the people who worked in these teams was tended to be much more active, not just simply passive and listening, but doing. So that was basically how SafePath developed. And then I was traveling for a period of time all over the Netherlands, doing it in teams, getting nice results. One of my PhD students did her thesis on it, which we published in 2019, which got good results. The teams, SafePath functioned better, and it created a better environment on the wards, and they had less need for physical interventions with the clients. And then when the pandemic hit, we thought, oh, what are we going to do? And then we realized we had to go to a train the trainers model.
Right.
And that actually has proven really successful, because now what most people do is, no matter where they are in the world, they can come to us. They come online. And we have a training that only takes 28 hours. It's just 8 morning sessions, Central European time, over a course of a month. So each session of 3.5 hours, spread over a month, 2 days a week, 2 mornings a week. And when they come out of it, they are certified SafePath trainer coaches. And we've developed a whole implementation model, because what I discovered was you can give a really nice training, but if you don't really follow it up with regular coaching and all the places of learning, it's like learning a new language. I learned Dutch when I moved here. You got to practice. So we're still learning more about how to implement it well. And so, but in any case, we have a very well-structured model now where we give people handbooks, and I've developed questionnaires recently to help them with implementation, all kinds of tools. And once they're trained at us, they go back to their institution, they give a 2-day basic training. That's a 2-day boot camp in SafePath for per team maximum 20 people. And then immediately after, these same people start doing coaching with the teams on a 1 hour every other week basis. and they have a working group, and we can engage with them online, if they want supervision through this process. And I've been really amazed to see that some institutions where nobody has a schema therapy background can successfully implement this. I visited one of them in the Netherlands, an addiction center, the other week, because they seem to be doing so well. And they didn't have schema therapy backgrounds. Some of them maybe had a little bit, but not very much. And I wanted to see, is this for real? I visited, they're doing a phenomenal job.
Great.
So it suggests that you can actually learn this stuff, even if you don't have that background.
But I think that's a testament to both your and Lemoore's ability to make this simple enough for everybody to grasp and use and make it accessible. And I love that you offer that post-training support, because I think so many trainings, even clinical interventions, people never use them because they just have their 2 days and they go, oh, that's a bit hard. I don't know how to do that with X patient or whatever. So, it's just a beautiful way to bring schema therapy to people all over the world, where it's going to have help large groups of people, because it's not even limited to one-on-one therapy work anymore. It's whole institution. So that's just really
very
amazing.
rewarding. It's very rewarding to see how much impact you can have by becoming a coach, because you can help your team, you can help your whole organization. It's really incredible, because we're the well-trained mental health professionals, and working one-on-one is great. Of course, you can make a huge difference in somebody's life. You can make a bigger, at least a broader impact in certain ways. And it's a very nice thing. So in case anybody is still wanting to join, we're having our next training in English starting on November 3rd, and we still have some room. We're going to have people there from South America, the Middle East, Europe, and one of our trainers is from Australia. Lucy Swafield is one of our, we'll be doing a co-leading along with me and Lemoore.
That will be great. So if you send me the link, I can pop that in the, because I always put a bit of a update of what we actually talked about, and then anyways, things, and I'll put a link to the iModes cards, and people can check out the cards and watch all the videos, binge watch it like Netflix. But it'll be
exactly. Yeah, I get the winter where you are, so I guess that's what people are doing in Australia, right? You have the winter now, right? So you're approaching.
Oh, we're almost, we're in spring, moving into summer now, but yeah.
Oh, you're moving away. Oh, yeah, I get confused with the other people. So you're okay. People in my hemisphere have been watching it. Okay.
Yeah, you're going into the dark, aren't you? I'm very impressed that you can run the training in Dutch as well, by the sound of it. That's very, very,
well,
very
it's not perfect Dutch, but it's serviceable.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being with us live. I'll just end the live, and I'll just we'll say goodbye to everyone now, and I'll just have a quick chat to you before we finish up. So bye everybody, and thank you so much, David, for being
really welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye.